Past 2 in the morning at Kensington Palace, a bell rings in the servants' corridor, and a footman, who has been on his feet since 7 the morning before, pulls his jacket back on and climbs the stairs, because the bell belongs to Princess Margaret, and Margaret's bell is not a request. If this account has been useful, subscribing costs nothing, and more stories like this one are queued. The bell notification means you will see them. She wants a fresh drink or a cigarette lit for her, or simply a face in the room while she talks. He answers. He buttons the last button at the foot of the staircase, and he climbs, past the closed doors of a house gone dark, up toward the one room still lit. Everyone always climbed. Everyone always answered. Ask the people who worked those corridors what the job was really like, and they do not mention the parties or the diamonds. They mention the bell. Down in the servants' passage, a thin wire runs up through the walls to a little brass bell mounted over the door, and when that bell jumped on its spring, whoever stood nearest went, whatever the hour, whatever they had already done that day. That single sound, according to former household staff, was the thing they dreaded most about serving the Queen's younger sister. Not a shout, not a scolding, a bell that could not be argued with, because it was not a question. To understand why one small sound could hollow out a grown man's night, you have to start with the woman on the other end of the wire. She was born in 1930, the second daughter, the spare to Elizabeth's heir. From the cradle, she was raised to expect a life that mattered, a life of consequence, and then handed something else entirely, a life of waiting for a role that the throne, once her sister took it, would never quite hand her. She was the spare, and everyone in the household knew what a spare was for, to stand near the throne and to stay well out of the way of it, and she had so much to spend. Beauty that stopped rooms cold, a wit quick enough to make a duke look slow, a tongue so sharp that courtiers were still repeating her lines decades later, sometimes with a wince, sometimes glancing over a shoulder first. What she did not have, the one thing none of it could buy her, was a job, a purpose, a reason to walk into a room that was not simply being Margaret. Then came the first crack, and you can date it almost to the day. 1955. She had fallen for Group Captain Peter Townsend, an equerry in the royal household, a decorated wartime pilot 16 years older, with an easy warmth about him and, fatally, a divorce behind him. The Crown would not have it. A divorced man on the arm of the Queen's sister, barely 20 years after another divorce had cost her own uncle the throne, was a line the palace simply would not let her cross. So she was pressed, quietly, patiently, relentlessly, until there was only one answer left to give. She chose duty. She stood in front of the whole country in a written statement and let him go, to protect an institution that had already taken most of what she wanted from life. And she never quite forgave it. Hold on to that word, surrender, because the staff who came a decade later swore the bell was born the night she gave Townsend up. Think about what that did to the shape of her days. The man was gone. The role never came. The beauty and the wit and the sharp tongue had nowhere left to aim. What was left was a woman with a house full of servants, a fresh drink always at her elbow, a cigarette always burning down in the ashtray, and far too many empty hours to fill once the sun went down. And this is the part the official portraits never showed you. Not the tiara under the chandeliers, not the cigarette holder angled just so for the photographers. What her staff actually lived was quieter and stranger, and a great deal harder. It was how she ran that household once the guests had gone home and the locks had turned and there was no audience left in the place, but the people paid to remain. To understand the dread, You have to see what a night under her roof actually looked like. And it began with a clock she shared with no one. The noon she rose, the small hours she ruled. Long after the rest of the palace had gone dark, the clock was the first thing. She rose near noon, and while the ovens downstairs had gone cold hours before, while the rest of Kensington Palace lay dark and quiet, her rooms stayed lit. You could see it from the courtyard, one set of windows burning gold against a black sky, long after every other light in the building had died. Staff who served those years said the whole rhythm of the place had been turned inside out for one person. The people on call did not shape her night around their lives. They bent their lives around her hours. Picture your own workday ending. Now imagine it does not end until a stranger upstairs decides it does. That was the arithmetic of serving Margaret. A footman might come on at 7 in the morning and still be on his feet at 2 the next, waiting. Because being sent away was not the same as being free. He could lie down. He could not switch off. He was off only until the bell rang. And when it rang, it was never a question. Former household staff described a summons that carried no pleas and expected no delay. A drink to be freshened, a cigarette to be lit and handed across. Sometimes nothing at all, except a face in the room and a pair of ears. One footman remembered a night that got at the whole thing. He stood in the doorway of the drawing room while she talked, not to him, at him. For a full hour, he said, she spoke past him into the middle distance, as if the point of the evening were the audience and not the exchange. He was not expected to answer. He was expected to be present, an hour of standing perfectly still while someone speaks past you. That detail, more than any order, is the one staff repeated, not the barked commands, the silence you had to hold while a princess used you as furniture with a pulse. And the nights did not run short. They ran on. The glass emptied and was filled again, the ashtray filled too, and the same man who had answered at midnight was still there at 2 and sometimes at 3, because leaving was not his to call. The bell had rung. He had come, and coming once did not mean he was finished. The mornings had their own liturgy. A dresser described the ritual of the morning tray, and it was exact. The tea at one precise temperature, a hand held to the side of the pot to feel the heat, tested and correct before it ever went up. A single cigarette, the right brand, laid just so. Cut flowers on some days. And if the temperature was off, or the cigarette was wrong, the displeasure was immediate and cold. There was no margin. The tray was not breakfast. It was a small daily examination, and you either passed it or you did not. This is where a phrase kept surfacing whenever old servants talked. Off duty, one of them said, meant almost nothing under her roof. On paper, you had hours to yourself. In practice, the bell could find you in the servants' hall, with your chair pushed back and your feet finally still. And up you went. Off duty was a fiction everyone agreed to pretend was real. Think about what that does to a person over years. The loyalty these people gave her was real. Many of them stayed a long time, but loyalty never bought them rest. It bought them the certainty that no hour was ever fully their own, that the sound could reach them anywhere, that sleep was a loan the bell could call in whenever it liked. That is a particular kind of exhaustion, not the exhaustion of hard work which ends when the work does, the exhaustion of a leash you can never quite see the end of, and it would be easy to stop here, easy to file Margaret under spoiled and close the book, a difficult woman who treated the people beneath her as though they had no lives of their own, ringing a bell in the dark because she could. But that is not where the people who knew the most about her land. The biographers who went into her private papers, her letters, the notes and the diaries she left behind, begin to tell a different story. They do not defend the demands. They complicate them. What looked from the corridor like plain cruelty, they say, was not that simple. Something else was moving underneath it, something the footman on the stairs could not have named while his feet ached and the bell rang again. And yet the people who read those private papers say the cruelty explanation is wrong, that the bell was never really about the drink at all. It was about the one thing this princess could not endure, not for a single hour, and that one thing was a room with no one in it. Empty rooms frightened her in a way no stage, no crowd, no camera ever did. To understand why, you have to add up what the years had quietly taken. She had given up Peter Townsend in 1955, the one man she was ready to build a whole life around, and she had done it to protect a crown that never quite thanked her for the sacrifice. Then came the marriage that was supposed to be the answer to all of it. She wed Anthony Armstrong Jones, the photographer, and for a few bright years the pictures looked exactly like happiness. They were not. By 1978, the whole thing had come apart in full public view, splashed across the same newspapers that had once crowned them the most glamorous couple in Britain. A divorced princess, the first in the modern royal family. The very papers she had once sacrificed Townsend to spare now carried her failure on the front page anyway. So she reached the last stretch of her life, with most of the purpose scraped out of it. She had been raised to matter, to hold a role, to be needed by something larger than herself. Instead, she outlived the job long before she outlived the woman. The parties thinned, the old friends aged or died, or simply stopped coming, and into that widening silence, night after night, came the bell. That, the biographers who read her private papers argue, is what it was truly for. Not the whiskey, not the cigarette held out to be lit. The bell summoned company at least as much as it summoned service. When she rang at 2 a.m, what came climbing the dark stairs was not really a footman with a tray. It was proof that the room was not empty, proof that if she pressed the button, the world still answered her. There is one account that lands harder than all the rest. A friend who used to visit her late deep into the small hours said the ordering about was never the painful part to watch. You could almost laugh at the fussiness, the exact drink, the exact cigarette, the flash of displeasure if either came wrong. What stayed with this friend was the moment after. The footman would set the glass down, be dismissed with a nod, and pull the drawing room door shut behind him. And in that single second, the whole performance would go out like a lamp switched off at the wall. The wit, the sparkle, the sharp remarks courtiers quoted for decades. Gone. What was left was a woman alone under one light, a drink in her hand, and only her own thoughts to keep her. Sit with that image for a second. The door closes, and the performance has no one left to watch it. That is the whole story, folded into one closing door. Because here is what the 2 a.m. bell was never really about. It was not about the drink. It was about a woman who had been told gently and constantly from the very beginning that she mattered a little less. Second born, the spare, the sister who had to hand back the man she loved while the other sister kept the throne. She could not undo any of it. She could not summon Townsend back, or rebuild the marriage, or conjure the role she was never given. But she could summon a person. In the dead middle of the night, when everything else had been taken from her, she still held one small power, and she used it without apology. She rang, and someone came. That is what the bell was actually saying. Not bring me a drink. Do not let me be the only one in this room. Read it that way. and the dread the staff described changes its whole shape. They were not frightened of a cruel woman, not exactly. They were caught inside the loneliness of one hour after hour, with no clean way to answer it. There is no tray heavy enough to fill an empty life. You could be off-duty on paper and still be one ring away from her, because under that roof off-duty meant almost nothing, and everyone who served there learned it fast. She died in 2002. Her health had been failing for years by then, worn down by strokes and by decades of the very cigarettes she would once wring a man out of his bed to light. The household that had learned to flinch at her footsteps was long since scattered, retired, moved on to quieter houses and easier masters. The corridor she once ruled from her bed went quiet. The bell went still, and stayed still. And yet, ask the people who actually served her, the footmen, the dressers, the ones who climbed those stairs. Ask them decades later, when every reason in the world would push them toward the glamour. They do not talk about the parties. They do not reach for the diamonds or the famous names or the villa in the Caribbean sun. They talk about one thing, and it is always the same thing: the corridor in the dark, the stairs climbed one more time before dawn, and a bell that no footman on earth could ignore, ringing on and on into the small hours, for a woman who had everything the whole world outside envied, and almost nothing she had ever truly wanted.